think my role will not be very complicated because our today guest is a very experienced speaker, lecturer, scholar, and Professor Marcin Belov from Bulgaria.
And very nice person.
And very nice. Professor Belov is Associate Professor in Constitutional and Comparative Constitutional Law, University of Sofia St. Clement of Edycji. It's good pronunciation?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, it's fine.
You passed.
Okay. He's also Vice Dean of the Faculty of Law of this university and also Academic Director of the Master Program Human Rights Protection. Also President of Sofia Legal Science Network, and in fact this list is much longer. His curriculum vitae is very long. But to give you a small sample, Professor Belov has been a lecturer at many universities in Italy, Greece, France, Israel, Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and of course in Poland. As you may see, it is quite a geographical atlas. Professor Belov will deliver a lecture entitled Rule of Law in Flux, Rule of Law and Democracy in Times of Transitory Constitutionalism, Constitutional Polycrisis, and Emergency Constitutionalism, towards a global algorithmic technocracy. During this lecture, we will get to know this three concepts mentioned in the title, and much more, as you will see. So the lecture will last about 1.5 hours, and then we will have 30 minutes of discussion. So not to prolong, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Marcin Belov. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for this very kind presentation. Obviously, this shows that my wife is not very satisfied with traveling so much. So we had that bargain that I travel, but if I stay mostly in Europe, and since this is the center of Europe, I'm fine. I'm safe at the moment. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm very grateful to Marcin, to Monica, to Andrzej, and to all Polish colleagues, to the Faculty of Law and Administration of the Jagiellonian University in Krakow for the invitation. First, because after COVID, it's really great to see people that the people are alive and not just some screens here and there. And second, because I really love Krakow. It's my third time here, and actually, I'm coming from, I was teaching in Greece yesterday, and I come here, and these are two most preferred regions of mine, like Mediterranean and Central Europe, and I'm glad that I can be here with you. So the title looks very long, but actually you'll see that the presentation is even longer. So you have to be patient. I promise you that there are beautiful pictures in between, and at the end, so stay for the pictures, don't leave. Yeah, actually, unfortunately, this is a very topical presentation, which is actually very new. It's kind of outline summary of a book chapter that I'm going to publish with Routledge in an edited volume. But actually, it shows that life is really dramatic nowadays, and everything is going very fast. So even that presentation, which I actually prepared some weeks ago, is already a bit outdated, as you will see with the number of crises. So there are new crises which have emerged meanwhile, and I'm afraid to wake up tomorrow because I don't know what will happen tomorrow, right? So I prefer to live today. So as you will see, as my dear colleague was so kind to say, we are going to revolve around three main concepts: transitory constitutionalism, constitutional polycrisis, and emergency constitutionalism. And because it's a long presentation, you need an outline of the main issues. So we'll see how emergency constitutionalism and constitutional polycrisis affect rule of law and democracy in times of constitutional transitions. Just to give you an initial idea, what does polycrisis mean? So this is a phenomenon where you have multiple crises that overlap, right? So I don't know if you watch these very famous or infamous National Geographic series about the plane crashes. I was watching them before the pandemics. Now I'm healed from fear of flying because I enjoy my liberty to fly. But you know, usually the plane crash happens when there is a coincidence of three things: technical issue, bad meteorological situation, and pilot's mistake. Right. So this is like technological, description of the polycrisis. We have witnessed multiple crises, which I will outline in the presentation, and they don't go away. Right. They stay, they overlap, and they actually create the new normalcy, which is the emergency constitutionalism. Right. So mentioning emergency constitutionalism, this was a very exotic topic 3 years ago, right? So like some people were kind of interested in researching, for example, the specific regimes provided by some constitutions, most notably the German one, to cope with different crises. But this was like a very exotic phenomenon. And when I was teaching that, I was even not capable of thinking of real cases, how to show and demonstrate the need for emergency constitutionalism. And nowadays, this is the topic, one of the most the main topics. So this was the case also with the financial crisis. Nobody was really interested in that before it came. With migration, although it was a traditional issue, with algorithmic constitutionalism. So we're witnessing that the last 10 years were a period of mushrooming of lots of new phenomena. And this also changed, I have to tell you, the way you write and publish, because previously the people were writing books, then they started writing articles because it was faster, and now they publish in blogs, right? Because the moment you write it, it's already old. So you have to be really fast and furious, and I'm usually fast and furious, but since I like very much Krakow, I'll be just fast and not very furious. And then we'll see actually that there are multiple factors, both endogenous and endogenous, producing that permanent transition to somewhere. And we'll see that actually the old-fashioned theory of transitology is not really capable of explaining what happens, because transitology is kind of science which emerged in the interwar period, but it was kind of very popular when exploring transitions from authoritarianism to democracy. Especially in Latin America, and then it was applied to Central and Eastern Europe. And it was like semi-optimistic theory, right? Because it brought to the fore the hope and the expectation that there are goods and bad regimes. You have the black totalitarian regimes, the good democratic, and you have like sooner or later a transition, right? So sooner or later the people are freed from Sauron, right? The white tree is blossoming, the Aragorn is coming on the white horse, and we are, some of us, fast, like the champions, Poland, Hungary. Oh, they're not champions anymore, especially Hungary, but other like a bit more hesitant countries like Bulgaria, slower, but we are like snail way moving towards the right direction. And suddenly, it seems that first of all the target has moved away, right? So the target has been moved, and the champions like reached the target, but it's a different target now. And then there were other transitions that are ongoing, right? So it's not just authoritarianism versus democracy, but we witness transition from constitutionalism within to constitutionalism beyond statehood, and suddenly we almost reached it. It was almost there, the supranational paradise, and now we are in a context of a new transition towards something else, I would say much worse, namely global regionalism, right? That's what happens 200 kilometers away from here. And other transitions, even more profound, even more challenging, because these transitions, authoritarianism, democracy, or nationalism, globalism, regionalism, have occurred also previously in history, right? So this is not very radically new. We have some conceptual apparatus, we have some ideas, we have some experience. So it's a very dangerous disease, but we have antibiotics, right? They are bad antibiotics, they destroy your body, but still we have it. But there are new transitions to which we are not prepared. And they're both good and bad. They produce huge progress and huge perils and challenges to our concepts, namely the transition towards the digital society, right? So we have an overlap of two game changers, right? The game changer one is not so novel, globalization, right? So to quote Daphne Barak, Israeli professor, who established actually the IACL, the International Association of Constitutional Law. When she established it, it was like a boutique organization with 10 member states. Now everybody is there. And when she saw it, look, the world has become world, right? So we have a brand new, framework. Hello, dzień dobry. And then also the technological revolution, right? Just to give you a glimpse of what is ongoing, because we're going to discuss this in detail a bit later. But actually, if you look at the previous industrial revolution, with the invention of the steam engine, right? Or actually with the reinvention of the steam engine, because steam engine was known also in ancient Greece. it was used to move the wings of the angels on the ancient Greek theater, right? In a very primitive form, but it was rediscovered in the 18th century, and it produced brand new civilization. It produced brand new class, the bourgeoisie, which clashed with the aristocracy, and they needed a social contract, and it created brand new world, the Western constitutional modernity, and that's why constitutionalism is Western plus modern phenomenon. It didn't exist before, it didn't exist elsewhere. It was transplanted elsewhere, but it didn't exist elsewhere. So imagine what will happen and what is happening right now in front of our shocked eyes, if we have eyes to see, of course, with all these new inventions, all these new technological inventions, not only related to the information technologies, not only related to mobility, but also related to the forthcoming revolution in the next 3-5 years. Bio-revolution, right? Personalized medicine, nanomedicine, 3D printing of organs, all this interconnectedness, technological interconnectedness, and the most provocative attempts to create parallel reality, right? Like metaverse. Of course, metaverse is a business project right now and not very successful one, but still that's the direction. So Google is trying to experiment with singularity, and there are projects of transhumanism, right? So this is really a game changer, right? We have never experienced it before. And I can tell you that like 5 years ago, this will sound like science fiction. I would be like some preacher, some sect, post-humanism and stuff like that. And now it's reality, not only reality, but I have to tell you that last autumn, they published the first volume of digital history. So something which was actually science fiction has already history, has made history for 5 years. Okay, so this is just the general framework of what I'm going to talk about. Just to explain the 3 additional terms I use. They're really deserve more attention, but I don't have much time to explain them now. But just to know that I call Westphalian constitutionalism the traditional national constitutionalism refrained within statehood, based on hierarchy, authority, based on vertical dimension of power. And then post-Westphalian is the global one, which had also, of course, different aspects. The most provocative was the attempt to create global government, but it's impossible. Then the real strive was to create one or more supranational regimes, the most advanced of which was EU, which was to an extent followed in Latin America, for example. Not that much EU, but mainly the practice of another institution of another organization, the European Court of Human Rights, was followed by the Inter-American Court. And then the new Westphalian thing is the, well, to make the long story short, did you read one of the most important constitutional scholars, George Orwell? Right? So George Orwell describes these 3 big power blocks, right? East Asia, Oceania, and Eurasia. So that's what is ongoing right now with this tectonic reshifting of the world, right? Yeah, so these are the 3 main concepts around which the presentation revolves. Now yeah, I have to increase the pessimism. I'm actually specializing in telling sad stories with a smile. So I'm a little bit like this. How do you say this? Executor of death penalties in Tower. They had a new one, very good one. And when he cut the head of the prisoner, he said, "Well, you're really good. I didn't feel anything." And he said, "Well, you can just move your head now." So that's what I do. But actually, we have witnessed several predictions of the end of history, right? Can you imagine which were they? Like 2 of them were made by very profound, very famous German philosophers of the 19th century. And the 3rd one is here on the PowerPoint, the prediction of Francis Fukuyama. That's the last failure, because Fukuyama predicted that we'll witness the end of history in a new liberal form, and actually the history doesn't end. And the previous 2 prophets of the end of history were, do you know who? Hegel and Marx, right? For Hegel, the history ends when the state is fully accomplished, right? So when I read the philosophy des Rechts, philosophy of law, I thought that he's crazy, because he was just writing about the world spirit, walking through different destinations and then finally reaching its real home, the state, right? So that prophecy was not fulfilled because the state, as he suggested it will be, and well described by another German scholar, Georg Jelinek, in his Drei Elementen Lehre or 3-element theory, was kind of more or less accomplished at the end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and then it was not the end of history, right? So it was partially dismantled and challenged. Marx, with the class-free society, it's an obvious failure, and now we have witnessed that failure. Unfortunately, the teacher of Fukuyama, Samuel Huntington, is again in vain. Namely, he wrote that very famous book. He wrote a lot of books, of course, but the most famous is The Clash of Civilizations, and we're witnessing the Clash of Civilizations right now. Yes, so I told you democracy has traditional and new rivals. The traditional rivals are, again, very dangerous, but still we have some idea how to cope with them, or at least we have some idea what happens if we don't. But the novel mixed forms are really, there are different forms of novel challenges. Some of them are a mixture of the old ones, right? So these are the old challenges in a new form. Others are really new, right? So to an extent, we are in a situation like in the 30s, in the interwar period, but again, these two game changers, the globalization, the technological revolution, doesn't make us really cope with that, with the remedies provided by some liberal democratic scholars in the interwar period. And just, well, I'm not going to discuss the traditional forms, but just to mention three of the more recent challenges to democracy and rule of law. Two of them were over-researched. I was teaching in Frankfurt a course called Comparative Constitutional Populism. And I dare to say that this was one of the three courses in the world that I suggested. So it was the mine course in Frankfurt, and then the other one was in the European University Institute, and the third was one in Yale. And at that time, which was 2015, that was like very original. Now it's mainstream. Like there are trains with books, the trains that can be filled in with books written on populist constitutionalism, constitutional populism, illiberal democracies, and stuff like that, right? So it's like lots of things emerged. Meanwhile, however, just to tell you another personal story. Unfortunately, you are also involved in it. I don't know if you know or realize that. I feel like a child of parents who get divorced. I have like 6 parents, 3 couples of 2, which are right now divorcing, and it's very painful for me. So I feel like a teenager with divorcing parents. The first couple of parents that I have is liberalism and democracy, right? The second couple of parents is democracy and representation. Maybe that's the first one, chronologically. So representation plus democracy, liberalism plus democracy. And the third one is actually the most problematic divorce couple, capitalism plus democracy, right? Just to tell you, to make the very long story short, because again, there is a lot of things written on that, but representation and democracy were actually contradictory concepts until modernity. So this is an example how constitutional magic and deceit, to quote Günther Frankenberg, works, right? So we, I mean, the real constitutional scholars, we are like magicians. We make things which are logically incompatible to work. And representation in the Middle Ages was like very elitist concept. So the person who represents should be beyond and outside of the community, like the king, right? Again, to quote, which shows actually that I'm old, because when you have Facebook and quote The Lord of the Rings, it shows that you're like 35 plus. when you're on TikTok and quote Game of Thrones or something like that, then it's a bit better, you know. You still have time. But to quote The Lord of the Rings again, the white tree of Gondor blossoms only under Aragorn, right? So the other guys are just replacement. They can be smart, they can be strong, they can be brave, but they are not the king, right? And the same is true for the Pope, right? Exactly because the Pope is supra-communitarian authority, that's why he represents everybody. Otherwise, he will be just a politician, right? This was the medieval understanding of representation. Democracy was something remote, right? It comes from where I come right now, from Greece, and there, a certain period of time, because the climate is healthy, the people eat a lot of olive oil and it's sunny. So at a certain point, they were raped to have democracy in Athens under Pericles. Now, the very moment I said that, it shows that it was kind of unique, but close to inexistent, because it was for a very limited period of time in Athens, and it was also very limitative, because it excluded the women, and now we lose like 60% of the population. It excluded the slaves, it excluded the young people, the foreign. So it was like, again, elitist government, right? And I regret to tell you that the prototype of admiration in ancient Greek world was not Athens. It was an invented tradition, to quote Hobsbawm, that emerged in modernity. It was Sparta, which was a proto-fascist dictatorship, right? Military dictatorship, right? So democracy was actually a theoretical model, right? Something like an imaginary society, utopian society, which you can claim existed in Greece or in Switzerland or whatever. Right? And the modernity mixed these two forms in a very beautiful way, of course, with compromise. It was a representative party democracy, and then we have the bad guys and stuff like that. But still, it was functioning. It was promoted during the long 19th century. It blossomed during the short 20th century, and it seems to be kind of in deep crisis, as we'll see. The second couple, I will be very short here, is liberalism and democracy. These two ideologies were relatively well reconciled within representative democracy as a framework. So we had lots of sources of through which we can invest the popular will. We had parliaments, we had democratic elected governments, sometimes directly elected presidents. We had elements of direct democracy and stuff like that. Right? We had devices for expression of the majoritarian will for political inclusion and participation, but on the other hand, we had elements of expertise and counter-majoritarian, checks and balances. The most important two islands are the courts and the administration, right? So they were kind of balanced, these two elements. The one, fundamental importance for rule of law, right? The courts especially, right? So if you are kind of detach liberalism for democracy, you will say what matters is personal autonomy, personal freedom, personal liberty, and the rights, and we need only the safeguards. The courts, everything else is consequential. And then if you are focused only on democracy, you will say, well, rights might be important, but what does matter is the community, the majoritarian will, and the rights are just a derivative of the will of the majority to give its own form, right? To quote the very famous but also important author Carl Schmitt, right? Who said, "Das Volk kann nur akklamieren," the people can just acclaim, right? So we're witnessing again the divorce there, and a lot of things have been written here on that divorce. Read, for example, the words of Paul Blocker, who is focusing a lot on that. And the third divorce is the most profound because it's the most objective and the most will have a much deeper and long-lasting impact. The divorce between capitalism and democracy, and that's really a game changer, right? Because actually, I have to tell you, if you follow the very fast way I present that stuff, but I have to be excused because I teach a lot in Italy, so I'm supposed to speak very fast there. That's a requirement. You sign a contract that you'll have to speak very fast. Anyway, but actually, capitalism was precondition for the emergence of modern democracy. That doesn't mean that all capitalist societies are democratic, right? But it means that before capitalism, there was no democracy, right? And then it seems, why? Because capitalism was a result of the Industrial Revolution, and capitalism produced two socio-legal factors for democracy: the middle class. It was a very long process, so I'm oversimplifying this. But anyway, the middle class, without the middle class, you cannot have democracy. The dismantling of the welfare state is very much related to the diminishing chance of democracy also in Europe. And you need what ABCS calls TFZ, or the third estate, right? You need this enlightened part of the society which has this proactive drive forward to the future. And it seems that the success of some non-democratic capitalist systems, which combine moderate or extreme forms of authoritarianism, or at least control democracy, with extreme neoliberal economics, has produced for the first time a teaser to try to experiment with capitalism without democracy, or to try to experiment with neoliberal capitalism with democracy, or with some compromised democracy, or some facade democracy. Far East is a clear example, right? China, but also Singapore. And a country very close to here as well, right? Hungary, right? Because if you wonder where does the inspiration come from for the Constitution of Orban, it was Singapore, which was, because you have this combination of very liberal approach to democracy with lots of compromises to traditional liberal democracy, right? So the claim there was that it will be a democracy, but illiberal. And then many authors have focused on that side effect on the deficiencies from the viewpoint of rule of law and liberalism, right? But also some authors start to think about the other side effects, on the other hand, the deficiencies with view to dismantling of democracy. And if you read the book of one of the most interesting scholars in that field now, Mike Wilkinson from London School of Economics, called, I think it's like Authoritarian Neoliberalism or something like that. It's published by Cambridge University Press. So he focuses on the opposite fear, that actually sometimes liberalism can also be illiberal, right? So we can have illiberal democracies, which are making huge compromise, and put it in mild term, with democracy, but we can have something which sounds paradoxical, illiberal liberalism, right? Liberalism which is just a facade for illiberal practices, right? Okay, so that's a very problematic context, right? Okay, I'm going to skip this because I don't know how much time do I have. But just to make the very long story short, it seems, and this will be the conclusion, so you can have already some glimpse at the final part. It seems that both democracies, but also authoritarian regimes, are in deep crisis. So it's obvious in the case of democracies, but it's not so obvious, but still visible also in authoritarian regimes, because they also do not deliver well. So it may seem that we'll have masqueraded authoritarianism and masqueraded democracy, hiding technocracies, right? So in societies where the people adhere and would like to be governed in a democratic way, we'll have democracy masquerading technocracy. And in countries where the people are used to prefer authoritarian regimes, they will be presented with somebody who is supposed to signify and symbolize the strong hand. Although if you look at some of the strong hands around, they're not so strong as they're supposed to be, right? So again, these both kind of alternatives from the past are in deep crisis, right? And we don't care much about authoritarianism because we hope we live in democracy. But authoritarianism is in crisis as well, the traditional authoritarianism, because it cannot cope with the technological revolution the way it coped with other challenges from the past, right? Okay, I'm skipping that as well. Just to say a few words. Actually, it seems that actually transitions are not unilateral. Sometimes you have what they call democratic backsliding, but also it's not only about backsliding, because backsliding means that you go forth and back, so there is one line. But sometimes the line shifts, and there are many levels of change, right? Which creates the complexity of the thing. So now we can think that we live in something which a Romanian scholar Manuel Gutan calls tendential constitutionalism, right? CEU region is a very good example. Many of the post-communist elites, especially in Romania or Bulgaria or countries like that, but also elsewhere, I think Slovakia, but also elsewhere, have mimicred, right? They performed mimicry. They like change the clothes, but for preserving the power on the ground. And on the other hand, you have a permanent transition, right? So the question is whether the transition and the emergency are not the normalcy, right? Because the question is, do we have a really stable phase where we can say, well, this is the end of the transition, and now we live in the normalcy, right? As you will see, I don't think we have such phase. Well, in Poland, you may have had the feeling for a while, until from, I don't know, maybe the first 15 years of the 20th century, the 21st century, that there was a stabilization. But then the multiple crises that hit everybody, not only in Europe, but in the world, actually, I think changed a lot that feeling. And just to give you another thing, the example, when you talk to constitutional scholars, which are also politicians, I'm not going to mention names, of course. When you speak with people from France or Germany, they have this narrative about Orban and Poland. You know what I mean? On the other hand, when you speak with some Hungarian scholars who are also involved in in constitutional making, they say, we, the democracies, and they, the rule of law countries. Right? So you have this, increasing discrepancy between camps, and the camps will proliferate, I have to tell. They will not be binary because there are additional cleavages that are cross-cutting this cleavage. Okay. Now, let me focus on more interesting things. Constitutional polycrisis, right? Because transitions, well, I think I was relatively clear what I mean. But let's talk about constitutional polycrisis. And there are actually two main groups of factors and aspects which create constitutional polycrisis: internal and external, right? So look at how beautiful the internal factors look like. And they're not the most problematic, I have to tell you, right? So if you go to an average German university, but I believe in Poland it will be the same, or in Bulgaria, or in everywhere, they will tell you that democracy is representative party democracy, right? So you have at least these three building blocks. You have systems for representation, right? And of course, there you can speculate, what do you represent? There are different forms of representation. You have territorial representation, holistic representation of the nation, and stuff like that. You have different theories about democracy, but also, obviously, the mass democracy that emerged in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, could not have been different but party democracy, right? Because the political parties were indispensable link between the people and the elites, right? And just to quote I would say one of the best definitions of representative democracy given by Robert Dahl, he says, we actually have oligarchy, which means representative democracy is elitist government where the elites are moderated by the people. So a system is not authoritarian regime or oligarchy, but democracy when you have elites. So of course, it's not the people who take most of the decisions, but the people can hire and fire the elites. They can punish them. They can give them benefits. So the elites feel that they're dependent on the will and the interests of the people, right? Right? Now, with the destruction of these links for democratic influence, control, and accountability, we witnessed the crisis of representation. In the late 80s, there were parties which emerged. They were called catch-all parties or omnibus parteien or something like that. And this was kind of welcomed as something very nice, right? So country near on the western side of Poland was kind of governed for a very long time with this moderate type of centrist policy, right? Which, tries to represent everything, like a little bit elements of conservatism, a little bit liberalism, a little bit social democracy. So you give to everybody something, and the party is actually not an ideological party. It doesn't represent certain strata like industrials or workers or peasants. It represents everybody, right? It tries to please everybody. And that's the problem, because when you try to represent everybody, you don't represent nobody, right? That's everywhere like that. You don't feel really represented. And this opened the wings, so to say. This was one of the factors that produced the emergence of the what we call anti-systemic or radical parties, right? Because everybody strives at the center, the periphery is kind of widely opened for hosts, right? Yeah, so nobody feels represented, I have to tell you, right? This led to, as you will see, to a strive for process, right? The people are not supposed, as most of the theories suppose they are, the people are not supposed to be zone politikon, right? They're not supposed to be political animals. They're also not supposed to be perfect economic maximizers of benefits, right? So I cannot, unfortunately, counterbalance the power of the IT giants or the gasoline giants, because I'm not the perfect consumer, right? The same is true for the participation in democracy. Most of the people don't know their rights, and even if they know them, they don't know their best interests. And if they know them, they are not supposed to engage in an everyday battle for rights, Kampfumsrecht, to quote Jering, So that's why we have also crisis of democracy, right? And also crisis of party democracy, which produced parties which doesn't mean anything, like with some strange names that do not coincide with any ideology. This has produced anti-systemic parties from both extreme right, extreme left, also other extreme poles of society, and it also put into the role of ideologies issues which were not supposed to be ideological but technological. Just to give you the most recent example, vax and anti-vax movements, right? So this is was supposed to be a very pragmatic issue, right? How to fight with certain diseases. Now it's a clear cleavage, right? So although we don't have, in most countries, we don't have a party which is explicitly pro-vax or anti-vax, the party started to oscillate around this new division line, right? Which was massive, right? And it was kind of normal because it shows that the anxiety of the people with the lack of control over their destinies with regard to technocratic issues, right? The same you can imagine will happen with the advancement of personalized medicine and transhumanism, right? So can you imagine a society where the people can live 120 years in a very comfortable conditions, so they can afford to change some of their organs, they do not have to wait for transplantation, they can have personalized medicine, not to take the general pills, but pills designed for them, design drugs. You know, it sounds a little bit different, you know. And other people could die at 60 by autoimmune diseases and by like GMOs and stuff like that, right? So it's not only a medical or biological issue, it's also a social issue. It's an issue about equality, and constitutional law has usually been about equality and freedom, right? So we fought against all forms of personal discrimination, racial, sexual, and stuff like that. We fought against political discrimination. We tried to dismantle the electoral census and to allow for full participation. We fought against at least excessive forms of economic discrimination, especially in Europe. The welfare state was an attempt to reconcile capitalism with that basic degree of equality, which was necessary for democracy. And it seems that we'll have new forms of inequality, which are much more substantial, right? Because one thing is to not be allowed to vote, another thing is to not be allowed to live, or to not be allowed to live in a way that other people can afford, right? So I don't mind if somebody drives Porsche or Mercedes, right? And I drive Škoda, because I drive Škoda. I mind if somebody lives twice longer as me and much healthier way just because he's richer, right? So it's a basic inequality, like very fundamental, right? One thing is to live in a nice house and have a nice car and have a yacht. Another thing is to be another type of species, right? De facto. Okay, so all this leads to representative democracy in flux, and this is I'm starting with the pictures. I promised you that this will be kind of fun. So this is a visual. Actually, that's, I think, a Polish painter, Rafał Olbiński, right? This is a visual representation of the very famous tree metaphor provided by the German Bundesverfassungsgericht, right? The Federal Constitutional Court of Germany said that representative democracy is rooted in what they call ununterbrochene demokratische Legitimationskette, uninterrupted chain of democratic representation, right? Which stems from the people, goes in the German case through the Bundestag because it's a parliamentary republic, and then it spreads, right? So if you cut the roots there, you have a big problem with the trees. It cannot be fed with juices and with water and with secret, Marcin. So what do you see on that picture? Do you see any discrepancy there? This is a Catalan painting.
Staircase?
And then, is something problematic there? Do you feel kind of anxiety, a discrepancy?
There shouldn't be any peaks.
There should be either lines on the staircases with peaks, with the lines, or peaks and peaks on the sculptures, right? So the palace is made for the lions, where the peaks go, right? And this is exemplified also by this, right? The mice are striking for mice power, supervised by the cats. And you wouldn't be surprised to see the next picture, I suppose. Yes, that's a very famous picture from the Animal Farm of Orwell, right? You recognize these guys? They're in the news, but they have different faces. Yeah. That's why the people look for Aragorn, right? They want the brave knight, le Prince Charmant, to save them from the misery, right? A lot of people dream for that. And what do they get is this, right? And we are there down, right? So we hope for this, and we get either this or this. I can tell you. Well, I'm Bulgarian. I'm supposed to be skeptical, so maybe you can just ignore this. You can say that somebody I was sitting too much under the sun in Thessaloniki, and yep. But it seems that Banksy has shown what's going on, right? We are tearing apart the social contract, and I mean not we because we are not allowed to, but the elites are right now renegotiating the social contract. And I would be very curious to see where will be my or your place in the social contract in the future world, right? Because I'm not sure if this is compatible with this in a better form, right? Now we go to the even more pessimistic part of the presentation. So I should have come here in November when it's darker in trains to make it more, context adequate, because otherwise it's very sunny outside. And then we'll talk about the exogenous shocks. Here they are, some of the crises, right? This is just a summary. Part of the presentation which is kind of outdated, as I told you. Because, for example, we don't have the war, right? It occurred like a couple of months ago. We don't have the energy crisis that is appearing, right? So you can see, like just in a couple of months, we have two shockingly important crises, which were themselves could have been the event of the century, right? So, like we live in a mixture between Third World War and Cold War, right? Depends where you are. You are either in the Third World War or in the Cold War. And the energy crisis, not to speak about other crises which we still cannot imagine, right? But this is just an outline of what already happened, and it's not going away, right? The security crisis, right? Previously, I remember the time when I could go to the airport 1 hour in advance and bring the water in the plane. Now it's impossible. Of course, you'll say that's not so problematic, but And then I remember the time when I was not wearing, but now it's almost required. And then the financial crisis, right? There were tons of inks and paper spilled and sacrificed to explain that it's possible to accomplish anti-cyclic state policy, right? To have a balanced budget, right? Who talks about the balanced budget now, right? Like there was like a fight for every cent to fight with the budgetary deficit and the public debt, and suddenly, one beautiful day, 75 billion euros were printed, right? And I would wonder, how would you explain that to the people in Greece or in Spain or in Italy who had to be fired or their salaries were decreased to fight for the Shangri-La financial constitutionalism, balanced budget? They almost reached the nirvana, the financial end of history, and then the target was again moved, right? All your life you strive for the paradise, and this paradise was the macro stability paradise, and it was like again moved away. And now we have a multiple crises emerging in the sphere of economy. I'm not economist, so I'm not going to speak about that. So we used to live in that reversed way, right? So you can see that on the average Polish table, but it's reversed, right? It's a glass and something like beautiful flower, not so beautiful actually, but reversed. So again, when I write such pessimistic things, because I publish these things as well, most in Rutledge and Hard, but also elsewhere. And some of the peer reviewers asked me, some of the questions are, but actually, isn't democracy usually prone to discontent, right? So democracy is always kind of fragile, because in contrast to authoritarianism, at least the official appearance of authoritarianism, democracy allows a degree of discontent. Democracy allows a degree of mismatch. So it's kind of normal for democracy to be turbulent. And I agree, but the question is that it's possible to a certain extent, right? So in Germany, again, this was one of, for obvious historical reasons, the need to balance between consensus and dissensus. Consent and dissent was extremely important. They even published these standard books about 35 years of the Grundgesetz, consensus and dissensus, stressing on the importance of both, right? But the question is, what happens if the atomic bomb explodes? If the nuclear power station explodes, right, and goes beyond the normality of nuclear reaction. Some constitutions. So these are actually the three groups of possible answers to that. Some countries like Germany, like the German basic law, provide for extensive emergency constitution, providing even for faster ways for adoption of legislation and stuff like that, because they wanted to pacify the nuclear energy, to grasp the spirit. If the spirit is out, to somehow still have some formal procedural rules how to cope with emergency. On the opposite, other constitutions do not have any provisions about emergency. And I have to tell you that this is Sweden. And this is the legal, which is the least important, because there are socio-legal factors which are more important. But the legal reason why there were no compulsory measures to fight against the pandemic in Sweden is that they were impossible to be introduced because they would have been unconstitutional, right? So it was based only on soft power, on nudging, on recommendations, right? But also I have to tell you that you have to study constitutionalism in context, because I work in a Swedish project where we have Swedish colleagues, but also Italian colleague. And the Swedish colleague said, well, it is not very recommendable to do this, but of course you can do this, but you have to reflect. And the Italian colleague said, well, look, this is the Swedish way to say no way. Right? So sometimes, you have to take that cultural context into account. And then most of the constitutions are in between, right? They provide for some basic forms of emergency, usually related to war, to disasters, natural disasters, and stuff like that, right? But actually, I have listed here 3 important authors which said, well, you cannot really pacify the extraordinary. You cannot really like tailor clothes for the emergency, right? And these are Carl Schmitt, Walter Benjamin, and the most recent one, Giorgio Agamben, right? Who said, well, it's either or, it's black and white, right? It's either emergency or normalcy. Of course, this is a topic of a separate lecture, so I'm not going to get into more detail here. Yeah, again, so you see there, again, this outline. And now we go to the almost last part of the presentation, namely how to cope with the crisis of rule of law and democracy. And I will show you the 5 variants which were used. Take off your pants and write down the variants. They're really important, very telling. This was variant number 1. This was variant number 2, very much related to this, right? Variant number 3. Variant number 4. This is where I am actually. And variant number 5, which is actually like variant number 1. So you can choose, of course, you have plenty of choice which variant you can use to solve. But I would just like to say a few words about variant number 3. And give you a Bulgarian example. There were several, not very few, decisions of the courts, of different type of courts, different ranking of courts, who freed Bulgarian citizens from penalties, from fines, from administrative fines, for non-compliance with the rules imposed to fight against pandemics. But what is interesting is the motivation of the court, why they were freed. Because according to the court, it was impossible for the reasonable citizen to follow so contradictory rulings of the Minister of Health. So it was impossible to really understand what is required by you. And that's why they say, well, the normal person should not be able to follow this, so you're free to go, right? Yeah, just to tell you a story of mine, I had to fly to Prague for a conference via somewhere in Germany, Munich or Frankfurt anyway. And it was impossible because if you come from a Schengen country, which is not Bulgaria, it's possible because it doesn't count as an entry into German territory. But if you come from non-Schengen country, you have to test in between the flights. And I have like hour and 20 minutes to change the plane, which makes absolutely funny to go somewhere, even if there is some place in the airport, to make a test in this 1 hour, and then run and jump in the next plane, right? And stuff like that. So when you come back from Greece to Bulgaria, because we like to go there, it's not a very bad place, I have to tell you, you have to read permanently, you had the, not now, but you had to read exactly in which list of countries is Greece, because they like shift them into different zones. And if it's in the orange zone, you can kind of enter through normal certificate, but then if it's in the red zone, you have to do something else and stuff like that, right? So you go for a holiday for a long weekend, and then suddenly you test 3 times, and when you go back, you have to read a lot of requirements. And I'm a lawyer. So you can imagine that the average tomato seller would definitely not be in position to go to a holiday, because he has to have a kind of at least summer school, not to say PhD in law, in order to be able to understand what the minister requires. And I have to tell you, that's a true story. I'm joking about Bulgaria because I don't want to be impolite with other countries, but there are even worse examples than this. So we're supposed to be the bad guys, and that's why. And I'm Bulgarian, so I'm excused. But you know, the Bulgarian Minister of Health issued one of the many ministers of health during that phase, issued an order that it's prohibited to, that was in the first wave of the pandemic when there were 20 people contaminated. It's prohibited to sit on soft surfaces. So in the restaurants, you shouldn't have soft chairs. And he didn't knew that his own order, because when he was asked by a journalist, so what should the restaurants do with the soft chairs? Why? What's the problem with the soft chairs? They said, well, but you have said that they shouldn't sit there. Well, really? Okay, well, then they shouldn't sit, right? So stuff like that, because it's kind of ridiculous. Somebody from the administration made all possible efforts to, and there was also a very interesting order of the Minister of Health, which made Bulgaria, maybe, I hope, but maybe I'm too optimistic, the only country in the world where it was for a while officially allowed to kidnap old people and people with chronic diseases. Yes, and this was not due to Orwellian reasons, this was just ignorance, but the result was there. I mean, the order said that if you are above 60, or if you have a chronic disease, like, for example, diabetes, and if you are contaminated, you want to go to Greece, you go for a PCR, you test positive, you don't have any symptoms, you're fine. But you just test positive. And they should send you immediately to hospital against your own will. You must go to hospital because you're contaminated and it's a very risky for your health. But you're like a former basketball player, 60 years old, who wants to go to the Greece, to the beach, and suddenly you go to hospital. Right? And they abolished the order, not because of humanism, but because they realized that if they really fulfill that order, there will be no free place in the hospitals, right? So, of course, China solved this through building hospitals in the stadiums, but it will be ridiculous to overburden overburdened system with bringing people against their own will there, right? Because they are 25 years old, but they have diabetes or something like that, or because they're 60 years old, and yep. So it's like we're here. Okay. Now, the final part of the presentation. The global algorithmic technocracy and post-democracy. Now, there are actually 3 main groups of factors which produce these trends. There are global challenges, there are technocratic challenges, and there are algorithmic challenges. So you should not mix technocratic with technological, right? They are 2 separate challenges, although the technologies promote technocracy also naturally, objectively, right? Because the people, but also the politicians, are overburdened, right? You cannot expect from the ordinary people to be knowledgeable of traditional issues, such as what kind of taxation do you prefer, whether you prefer low or high taxes, whether you want war or not. But these are traditional issues from the 19th century or 20th century. Now, if they ask you something about biomedicine or GMOs or whatever, I mean, of course, you rely on prejudice or on what you have heard, but you're definitely much far away from being an expert. You're also not expert in war, but you have some kind of natural feeling, whether you want it or not. And here it's most of the people will even not understand the question which they're asked for, right? If you ask them, do you want the introduction of biometric data, right? A question which was asked actually in Switzerland in 2009. Anyway, okay, this is the list of the global challenges. Globalization, I'm not going to talk about it because it sounds intuitively kind of understandable, but crisis of territoriality, this was a very modern concept 10 years ago, and it consists in many things. I'm going to quote, that's another quotation I like, a quotation from Sheila Ben Habib. She says, democracy requires closure, because if you apply the traditional Jelenikian concept of state, like the state is territory plus people plus power, it looks very reasonable, right? It's beautiful, it's heroic, it's understandable. It was bloody because if you know, in order to reconcile territory with people, you had to fight wars. That's why nationalism was so violent, right? But still, so it means that actually, if you have 1 million immigrants in your territory and 1 million immigrants which went away from your territory, the question is who are the people, right? And if you combine that definition with the previous definition of Robert Dahl, then it seems that, well, you can say, well, the bound is not necessarily the blood, but it's the citizenship, right? But then the question is, what happens with the Poles living in London, right? They don't have, some of them, a lot of them don't have British citizenship. So in a sense, they are object of law, right? They have to follow tax policies, criminal law policies, driving policies, and so on and so forth, health policies imposed by a government that they cannot select, and they can also not directly or indirectly influence. On the other hand, they vote for Poland, right? So they don't experience the result of their voting, but they vote for Poland because formally they are part of the people, right? And then you have like 1 million Ukrainians, and this is the same, and so on and so forth, right? So Poland is maybe not the best example, but there are much more. There are other countries where you have like huge emigration and immigration both, right? So then the question is, right? And you have a lot of other issues of crisis of territoriality. For example, in tax law, right? How do you tax the big giants, or in, right? So territory, the territorial container was decompressed, right? It exploded, right? And we needed rules that govern trans-territorial phenomena. I have another paper of that related rule called rule of law in spaces of laws, because our devices, our concepts of rule of law, democracy, sovereignty, and so on and so forth are considered to be territorial, right? We work with jurisdiction and stuff like that. But then you have a lot of phenomena which are trans-territorial, which cross-cut territories, like pandemics, like information flows, like financial capital flows, like what did I miss? Yes, several flows, right? And what is even more challenging is that you have also post-territorial phenomena which are not allocated anywhere in the physical reality, right? Internet, right? All of the social media which are internet-based, but also the new digital reality which is emerging and which is partly detached from the physical reality. So these attempts of creating metaverse are just very initial, but it is absolutely sure also related to Internet of Things, smart cities, and stuff like that, that we will witness the further development and the further emancipation of digital reality from the physical reality, right? So they will be to an extent intertwined because your washing machine or toaster are computers, so they're physical, but also there will be a metaverse, like upper level. And that's why with regard to semiotics, the last book that I published, Robert Sherwin has published a very nice book called, I don't know what was the book called, but his claim is that we're living in the age of digital Baroque. Because in Baroque, which, Morocco, this very famous period, there was like a multiplication of the universe as well. So the people believed in meta reality, in the other world, in the God's world, right? They lived in the physical reality, but they created a range of artificial realities related to art, to paintings, and stuff like that, right? And now we are having also technological devices to create really metaverse, right? Digital plurification of the realities, digital Baroque. This concerns something which I explore in that last book of mine, Constitutional Semiotics, the memification, emojification, and digitalization of law, right? So we have experienced three very important terms. We, means the lawyers, we didn't realize that yet, unfortunately, because we're too conservative. But this has been realized not only in the social sciences and humanities, but also in other positive sciences, so to say, like geography. So there was linguistic term, well represented by a lot of French scholars like Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, and others. For example, they claim that, sovereignty, there is something like a textual sovereignty, right? Sovereignty is a textual issue. It's related to the ultimate text. And Roland Barthes has written a very famous something like paper, which explores the death of the author and the birth of the narrators, right? So we have the moment when the Constitution is produced or the law is produced, the author dies, and then there is a birth of multiple narrators, but also visualizers, and that's the visual turn, which is emerging right now. This turn towards the way we not only read and write law, but also the way we perform, the way we visualize, express law. And for example, you have a lot of visual content which is legally relevant, which is not written, right? In Facebook, in Twitter, everywhere, even in TikTok, right? I'm saying TikTok because this is a platform of the young generation. Facebook is for all these. And the emotional turn. Ilji Privan, by the way, who is a Czech scholar, but he is director of the Center for Socio-Legal Studies in Cardiff. Has just published a very nice book on constitutional imaginaries, if you're interested, apart from my book on constitutional semiotics. Paul Blocker works with that. Jan Komarek, many others, right? So Andras Shayo as well has published on emotional constitutionalism. Okay, and now, apart from that crisis of territoriality, we have also the re-emergence of territoriality, right? For example, the pandemic territoriality. So you are everywhere and nowhere. So that's a phenomenon which some authors call space-time compression, right? But also you can, in Italy, you are not allowed to go beyond a certain point, to go beyond your zone of the city, right? So you can be everywhere, but also you cannot move outside of your, so it's like a paradoxical situation. Okay, both hyper-territoriality and no territoriality at all, which is again challenging our fundamental framing concept of territoriality, which we use in public law, like constitutional administrative, but also in tax law and in other branches of law. These are the technological or algorithmic challenges. Yeah, so there are at least two very challenging and interesting debates here. The first one is related to the artificial intelligence, right? So we cannot be sure whether there is artificial intelligence in the way we use the word in science fiction, right? Autonomous robots, right? Then the question is, what is autonomous? So this is a long discussion. There are different criteria which are applied to define autonomy, like ability to reason alone, to adapt to the context, to feel emotion, stuff like that. But still, so we cannot be sure whether it is a real artificial intelligence, but for sure there are algorithms, right? Which are semi-autonomous from not only from the people, but also from the power centers, right? Because they're related to the other phenomenon, big data. So you cannot really manage manually big data, and that's why you need the algorithms. And I can just give you three paradoxical examples. The last one is from yesterday. I went to one beach in Greece with one travel company. And I was sitting next to the driver, and suddenly I got an invitation for Facebook, not invitation by the person, but suggestion for invitation for the driver of the bus. You know, it's not somebody with whom I have like permanent contacts. Yeah? And I recognized him because he has a very characteristic face. Otherwise, I wouldn't know that that's the guy. And his name coincided. Actually, it seems that he's kind of related to the owner because maybe his son, or maybe that's the owner. I don't know. But anyway, the bus driver. I saw an old friend of mine from the years of the university. Unfortunately, she's old because I'm old, and these were old times, good old times. But we met in a park. I mean, I was just walking. I just met her. Oh, hello, how do you do? I didn't see you for like 20 years, and we exchanged phones. And I immediately started receiving advertisement for her company. So we didn't exchange emails or phones. It's a very specific company, so it's not like pizza or shoes, right? Or travel agencies, right? And then another example is from my wife's office. When they were speaking about pizza, she suddenly received advertisements for pizza. But of course, you have to fill in the GDPR. It's very important. Because without GDPR, without agreeing, you cannot really read the sports or the weather forecast, right? Of course, you can opt out and live in the wilderness, in some jungle, you know? But otherwise, if you want to stay in part of the civilized world, you have to agree. Of course, you have the right not to agree, but it's like the super green pass in Italy, right? You know what's super green? What's the difference between green and super green? Green is, to an extent, kind of understandable. It means you can test. So if you don't want, you can just test, and they have these testing mode. Super greens means that it doesn't count for testing, right? So, and it was introduced for public transportation, for example. I'm not talking about very exotic things. I'm not talking about going to a hospital where you can contaminate people. I'm talking about you cannot use the bus without that. Of course, you can walk. And you can say, well, but then in Rome, the transport system is not very good, so anyway, you walk. But I mean, apart from that practical reasoning, of course, walking from Bologna to Siena is also an option. It's healthy. Not in the sun and not in the winter, and also not in the autumn, because there are a lot of hills, but still. Anyway. And these are some of the technocratic challenges to democracy. The rising complexity and the democratic detachment of decision-making, which is quite obvious, right? So in theory, you can control the mayor of Krakow. In much more theory, you can control the Polish government, and you cannot really control the European Commission, right? I mean, in theory, you can elect the stuff like that, but like, just to give you the obvious examples, which were like over-discussed in the literature, you can vote for the European Parliament, but then it's not the only player, and it's actually not the most important player. And then even if you vote for the European Parliament, you get more from the same, because you have a lot of parties. So it's like you have oversized coalition, and both grand coalition and oversized coalition. So you cannot say I want. You cannot really say I want Timmermans or Manfred Weber, because you get Ursula von der Leyen, right? That's the real situation, right? So that was a step forward, the introduction of this Spitzenkandidaten system, right? So when you vote for the EPP, you get Weber. When you vote for the Social Democrats or the Social, you get Timmermans, and none of them became president of the European Commission, right? Then there is a lot of literature on de-democratization, de-parliamentarization, executive federalism. Like actually all multi-level constitutional systems promote the competences of two players, the executive power and the constitutional courts or Supreme Courts. In America, in Germany, in Austria, everywhere. But in the European Union, it's the same, right? So you have more empowered executives and a very powerful court and disempowered parliaments, both on the supranational, but especially on national level. And like 15 years ago, this was one of the interesting topics. A lot of stuff has been written, some of which was implemented without much success. There were also very ridiculous ideas, like to introduce a third chamber, like European Parliament elected by the people, Council of Ministers elected by like members of the government, and then a third chamber elected by the Parliament. And this will be the end of decision making, right? With three players, you cannot adopt anything. So, or if you adopt something, it will be very broad, very compromised, like, and you empower who? Technocracies, because somebody has to take the decision. So if it's not the Parliament or the government, it's the courts or the bureaucracies which take the decision, right? Global judicial empire, what do I mean? The details, I have another paper on that. There is, you know, when the political players do not take responsibility and do not take lead, sometimes it's impossible for political reasons, because there are irreconcilable conflicts. Then you allow the courts to perform the political role, right? And the courts sometimes frequently dribble in the center, right? Because they don't feel very comfortable yet at being a real overt political players. So they exchange, you know, cases, it's judicial dialogue and stuff like that. Sometimes they attack and then they are smashed by the media, right? USA, Europe, any decisions, right? When they take a very obviously political, right? This creates a network of judiciaries, of courts, which is at least supranational in Europe, right? So in the context of that dialogue, of course, the more interesting from constitutional viewpoint dialogue is the one related to constitutional identity, right? And in Germany, there was, you know, because everybody focuses on the German Constitutional Court, there was this long line of decisions, like which were overexplored. But then in Italy, you have also a very powerful doctrine called contro limiti, you know, Tarico II, like Weiss and Gauweiler were important decisions in that respect. And also, unfortunately, a lot of people speak German, not so many Italian, but nobody speaks, apart from the Romanians, Romanian. And there was a decision of the Romanian Constitutional Court, which actually proclaimed the absolute supremacy of the Romanian Constitution. Nobody observed that. If this was the French or the German court, this will be like a revolution. And like the Romanians adopted that, and nobody really understood that this decision is adopted. And that's quite interesting, quite problematic decision, you know, because Russia also, the Russian Constitutional Court also said that the Russian Constitution prevails over the European Convention, but that's also problematic. First of all, because it's coming from a country from another perspective, but then also legally because it's obvious, it's like this, because it's an international treaty. But when you declare, because this tactical doctrine of the relative primacy of EU law was, molded, like a spider, like for a very long time, and then suddenly to say that your constitution ultimately prevails is like a big rupture with this. Like attempts at this were also the decisions of Vice II in Germany and Perico II in Italy. Bulgaria is a very interesting country because in Hungary the guys there say, well, the bottle should stay here and Europe stays here. There is obvious for, and when Europe says the bottle should stay here in Bulgaria, we say, okay, start to move the bottle slightly to the right direction. We fly under the radar. I mean, the guys who govern the territory. If you look at the attitude of the Bulgarian Constitutional Court, there is no explicit pronunciation what is the ranking, of EU law, but they kind of subsume, and there is also no constitutional provision about that. The EU integration clause is very strange. It's allocated in the part related to rule of law. I don't know why only there. And it says Bulgaria participates, the Republic of Bulgaria participates in the integration development, in the development of the European integration. And this is the same formula used by the last communist constitution from '71, which says that the People's Republic of Bulgaria participates in the development of the world communist community, socialist community, right? So it doesn't say a lot about where is the ranking, And if you look at the court's decisions, but the constitution actually doesn't say nothing about the EU law. So in theory, they are not allowed to control the compliance of the constitution with EU law, but actually they subsume EU law to other source of law which they are allowed to control, the international treaties. So you can treat this in a very controversial way. You can say, well, we are very pro-European. That's why we actually create through case law competence of the court, which is he doesn't possess, in order to safeguard European law. So we are very pro-European. Or you can say, well, but this is equalizing EU law with international treaties, and international treaties in Bulgaria are definitely under the constitution, right? So the European Convention of Human Rights is below the constitution, and the EU law, well, depends. You have to read the case. Anyway, I have moved away from the main topic, but it's, yeah. Other issues here, the epistemic problem. Roberto Michels has developed this iron law of oligarchy, saying that all organizations sooner or later becomes oligarchies. Doesn't matter whether it's a football club, party, or state. And then, Huxley is too much. A few words about post-democracy. This was a term developed by Colin Crouch in the book which is called Post-Democracy. And this is kind of outline of the main aspects of post-democracy. I am really running out of time. Just to say, so you can read what is actually post-democracy more or less there. But just to focus on the fifth bullet. Pierre-Rosan Vallon, who is actually a French professor, actually, sovereignty can be divided into positive and negative. Positive sovereignty, roughly said, means that the people are supposed to, the sovereign, whoever it is, the monarch, the parliament, or the people, is supposed to say what it wants, exactly, right? And negative sovereignty means that the sovereign can say what it doesn't want, right? So it seems that in this post-democratic age, the sovereign cannot say what it wants, but it seems it can still say what it doesn't, right? And this, again, leads to the promotion of either technocracy, would be the positive sovereignty, or to radical forms of protest, which are also to an extent detrimental to representative democracy, right? Because they distort representation, introduce a degree of violence and rupture in the system, right? Through massive and intense protest movements, frequently outside of the scope of the legally permissible, right? And then you have that interplay, very old one, between legality and legitimacy there. So sometimes something is illegal, but legitimate, right? The big protests, right? Which are, from a formal viewpoint, many of them illegal because they are during the night, or they're not following the route which is prescribed, or stuff like that, right? In Greece, they had a lot of debates on that, which in the times of COVID, you know, because they used very discretionary criteria which demonstrations can be prohibited or not in times of pandemics. I didn't really understood the logic, but like they had some very fuzzy, very dynamic criteria on that. Yes. And of course, if you're not prejudiced or ideological, you have to either refuse to accept the tendency towards technocracy, and you say, well, this is just temporary thing. We'll adjust, we'll revitalize the traditional concepts. Or you can start thinking whether actually you can pacify that technocratic future and reconcile it with not only democracy and rule of law, but what I'm really concerned of with constitutionalism, right? Because I can tell you another discussion which is kind of related to that, whether EU should be constitutional or administrative order, right? Because there are many authors, many of them are Americans, who say, well, European integration is very nice, but why should you pretend of being constitutional, right? So it's too much, right? You don't have a European nation, you have a lot of issues. So it's very fine, very reasonable, but why don't you talk not about global constitutionalism or supranational constitutionalism, but about global administrative law or supranational administrative union? Like this is also closer to the British idea of the common market instead of federal state, right? And then, of course, you can admit that it's much more realistic, right? And there are a lot of fake and facade things in European democracy as such. But if you renounce at least the strive towards not only democracy and rule of law, but towards constitutionalism, towards a system which takes into account not only the technocratic procedural dimension of power, but also the connectedness of power to certain values, and that allows also the political and public control by the people, then you're really living in the post-democratic age. Then you cannot have a reasonable and just claim why the people or the parliaments or even the governments should be in control, right? I told you about the minister. That guy, is he really competent? Is he really understanding what he does? So why don't we just outsource that power to the doctors, right? The same is true for financial issues. Like, why don't you just outsource it to budgetary councils? The same is true for everything. Like, why don't you just invite the experts, like the courts? And this is possible, and this is happening. But the question is that I was kind of attached to democracy. I'm from that generation when we were taught that democracy is good. And there was a point when I believed in it. So I'm not very happy with so easily renouncing my control over public power. Although it's fragile, although to an extent it's insufficient or fictitious, but still I like to have at least the feeling of control, right? I don't know about you. And I prefer to have somebody to hire and fire, even if I ascribe to that guy actually objective responsibility, because he's just the top of the iceberg. Instead of being governed by wise men, because then we are in the plateau state of wise men. And the problem with technocracies is like the problem with dictatorship. If you find the best dictator, that might be very efficient, right? The same is true for the wise men. If these are really the wise men, if they're really wise, and if they're really connected to the common good of the community, then this is much better than democracy. The question is, what happens if you get the bad dictator or the bad experts, right? Incompetent or cruel or self-interested, right? How do you remove them? If you get a cruel, incompetent, and bad politician, you can remove him or her. In theory, sometimes in practice as well. About the magicians, how do you remove Gandalf, right? How do you remove Gandalf? How do you remove the, no way. Because he is a magician, right? He predicts. Okay, and these are actually already existing forms of global technocracy. You can see them here. Agencyfication in European level. We were promised that if we create independent agencies, independent from the control of the political powers, from the governments, from the commission, this will lead to better expertise, and this will lead to less populism. Now we live in the age of populism, right? Also national level. I mean, I'm not going to quote countries because these are not Bulgaria, so I don't want to be impolite, but there were countries where the fight against organized crime and corruption was kind of great. because this allows for the creation of multiple agencies with a lot of secretary stuff. You have a car, a great salary because you fight against corruption and against organized crime. It's not just selling cucumbers, you're fighting the bad guys and stuff like that. So a lot of regulations and directives require bureaucracy, right? They provided for an agency. So like 30 years ago, this bureaucratic ocean didn't exist. Now we are like, we have agencies of agencies who take care of agencies. Global governance, I didn't speak about that, but I don't know if it makes a difference between global constitutionalism and global governance. Global constitutionalism is the better option, the more fictitious one. It means that you do not have only administration, technocracy, or governing of things, but you have also the political and constitutional aspect. So you have a replica of legislative, executive, judicial, and other powers that allows also for human rights. And of course, this was to an extent fulfilled in the case of the European Union, but apart from the European Union, you have some very fragmented examples, like maybe some courts, which were kind of almost self-empowered to do that, like the court in Strasbourg or the Inter-American Court, right? So global constitutionalism is a very beautiful idea, which is, apart from Europe, close to utopian, right? But global governance is not. It's there. And global governance means that one of the most important achievements of modernity, the public-private divide, has been blurred, right? So in the Middle Ages, in antiquity, the king owned the territory. The king physically owned you to an extent in many countries. And so the public and private were like very abstract categories. In the Roman law, there was a famous distinction by Cells, quoted by Ulpian, what is public, what is private. But in most countries, there was a fusion, like the public holders were also in monopoly of the private power. They all possess the main asset, the land, right? So if you do favors to the king, if you kill a lot of bad guys, whatever the king defines them, you get land, and that makes you politically powerful, right? So you're included, that's the code to be included in the elite. Modernity claimed that we should, and this was not related only to democracy, also authoritarian modernity, like in the sense of Leviathan, right? In Hobbesian modernity, claimed that we should make this distinction and give public functions to public bodies, elective or non-elective, right? But still public. And now we have global religions, but especially transnational corporations, who are performing public functions. Some of these public functions, in the times of new liberal privatization, were supposed to be not necessarily public. For example, water supply or energy supply or stuff like that, right? So we were convinced to think that actually water and energy are not common goods. They're just resource, and they should be sold on the market, right? So we more or less accept that, not everywhere, but this is kind of not that problematic at the moment, right? Of course, then the question comes, what happens with the scarcity of energy or of water? Some countries, like there were predictions that a real migration issue will emerge when you have water wars, right? I don't know whether it will be related to global warming or to other things, but anyway. The real big issue comes with the real public functions. Arbitration, so accomplishment of judicial functions, norm setting, and norm implementation, right? And there are a lot of science fiction novels which should be studied in constitutional courses, where you're actually a corporate citizen, right? So formally you're a citizen of something, but first of all, either your state is very weak, or even if it's not weak, you're actually much more dependent on de facto sovereign decisions by corporations, right? Related to a lot of things, especially to the resources of the future, such as information technologies, vaccination, healthcare, and stuff like that. And of course, there were a lot of issues related to taxation as well. So this was one of the, I'm not specialist in that, but there were a lot of things written on how to reconcile the crisis of territoriality in tax law and the taxation of the big companies. Because of course, tax havens and tax evasion is just a very, on the top of the iceberg. There are much more profound things, out of which people make a lot of money. So that's why I drive Skoda. Anyway, because I don't do this. Which is actually a very good car, I have to tell you. But that's another story. I just don't want, because that's recorded, I don't want to humiliate Skoda because they're very good, very good. Yeah. So, so it seems that global governance is unfolding, and it's unfolding in parallel to and beyond the official power structure described not only by our own constitutions, not only by EU law, but also by international law. And I really felt recently, 5 years ago, as a priest, Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, doesn't matter, who tried to explain the Industrial Revolution with religious dogmas, right? And that's why I started to try to go beyond, because even though you may be wrong, even though you may make a false suggestion, even though there are not sufficient raw material, you have to start thinking, because we don't live in modernity. We definitely live in postmodernity, we definitely live in post-democracy, and the world is there. The world is unfolding, the changes are very fast. If you look at the changes that occurred in the previous age, the technological development started in the late 70s, early 19th century, then the revolutions came much later. The English one was the first, but then the French, so like a century later, and then that civilization, which was promoted by the English, saying English, you know, if you have been to London, which is most probably you have done, if you go to the British Parliament and you go to one of the gates, there are three very important figures there. Because there are a lot of figures around that square between the Westminster Cathedral and the Parliament, and this very ugly center, Elizabeth II, which is like 80s, from the 80s. So two very beautiful buildings and one very ugly. But anyway, there are a lot of people like Nelson Mandela and I think Gandhi and many others. But the three figures, sculptures in front of the gate, can you guess who are these people? Because if you read the mainstream English history, you can think about other people. So who would you put in front of that gate?
Jeremy Bentham.
Okay, but he's already somewhere else. He's just, I don't know if you know that, but he's booming. I think he donated his fortune to the university, and he, under the condition that he will be mummified, and he will be exposed, and he will be brought to some academic councils. And like once in 2 years, they bring him there, and they write in the protocol that he was present. You know, so the people.
But no right to vote.
Yeah. So far. But no. So who you have there? You have. Who would you put there actually? So the one guy who is there is Churchill. The other guy who is there is a strange guy, although not impossible, Richard I. Well, why would you put Richard I there? You know, because he was a great warrior and he was leader he attempted the reconquest of Jerusalem and he fought with Saladin. But I mean, like, yeah, it's much better for a fairy tale than to put him in front of the parliament. And third one is somebody who you don't expect there, because he's the usual villain, the bad guy, Cromwell. You have Cromwell there. So yeah, so since Cromwell and the French Revolution, it took like the long 19th century, to put it in the words of Hobsbawm, for these ideas to spread, and then they will become really universal 200 years later. Now, you can see, only since 2009, we are living in a different world. So it takes, because of technological revolution, because of time-space compression, and because of the globalization, it will not take 100 years, it will not take 50 years, it will take 5. And we are in the third. So we are in process, and yeah, I'm finishing, don't go. Yeah, so that was it, yeah. Thank you very much for your attention. Now I'm ready to answer your questions.
So thank you, Professor, for this lecture. I can say that I'm 2 years apart, because on the one hand, it was very energetic, very interesting lecture. And on the other hand, I'm at the edge of depression, because there's so many challenges to our democracy today.
There are a lot of masochists in the world, because they usually invite me knowing what I will say.
Yes. Are there any questions? One. Any other questions? Because maybe first we can come to questions. First one, I also have.
You can ask everything possible in the framework of morality and legality. I don't promise I will answer, but I will.
So maybe the first question.
So first I want to thank you for an interesting lecture, and then I want to go to the question, and I want to come back to maybe the Fukuyama case, the end of history, and what we actually said that the end of history actually didn't came, but we make some statement that actually came in the minds of Western civilization, and they actually believe that. And if we says maybe that they care for democracy decreased, and because they actually treat democracy like air, like something that's so common, so obvious, that we don't need to care, and that was really open the way for a populist, because if the elites are thinking that we have everything, they start thinking about themselves and not about the people. And when the people issues are spread or grow, that's actually in my opinion the main base for the populist. And do you think that in some way that this belief is maybe strong, maybe more or less strong, which in the Western civilization elite minds can maybe be one of the issues that starts this pandemic of populists, like Professor Sadurski's title of book says?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. It actually entails a lot of sub-questions. And of course, the first question is what is West? Like, what do you count as West, right? So I have to tell you that in German, Austria was called Österreich, which means that this was the Eastern state. So the West stopped in Vienna. So I come from the East. From the Middle East, well, in Bulgaria, not in Bulgaria, but in English, you say Middle East because it means that Near East is Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, stuff like that. Right, so it depends what is West. Is Russia West? Is Turkey West? Is Bulgaria West? Is the West West? USA, right? How does the transatlantic thing looks like? Are there non-Western places or South Africa? Is it West? And stuff like that. Then the second question is, how do you define populism, right? So that will be tricky to say, to ask this, because there were thousands of articles and books written on that with a lot of criteria, not only Wojciech Sadurski, but also Klaus Mode or Karlswasser or Paul Bloch, or a lot of people wrote a lot of things. And still there is, of course, no unitary definition of that. And also democracy itself entails a little bit of populism, right? In order to, is Poland a populist country? That's a very good example, because well, if you ask many people, well, so this is a clear case of populism, right? On the other hand, you can say, but they are just following the opinion, right? So that's what responsiveness is called, right? So when you're responsive to the demands of the population, to the majority, then you are, which degree of following the opinion of the majority of the populace, and which makes you accountable, right? And then the other thing is who takes it for granted, right? Because one thing is the youngster who is not caring about politics and takes for granted the perfect life. So actually these guys are not taking for granted democracy because they don't understand either democracy or totalitarianism. They just have fun. Another thing is whether the politicians take it for granted, and what does it mean to take it for granted, and what do you take for granted? Again, so it's very complex, and why we witness the rise of populism, again, there are many reasons. One of them was the lack of feeling of representation and the need of proxies. So the people were always voting with queues, and the people want fast and efficient results. It's like invest money somewhere. I don't care whether the investor is really smart or whether he's a good person. I just want return, right? And if I don't get return, I don't care if this is a really honorable person. I just want the return, right? And that's the feeling of many people. They just want the politicians to deliver, and why they don't really read books to understand why they don't deliver. They just change. And if there is no change, they vote for radical change. And if this is not another change, they're disenfranchised, which is the other threat. The one threat is the radicalization. The other thing is the total disenchantment, right? Right, the total getting out of the sphere of politics, right? Which many people do. I'm not going to say which, because then I will be involved in that.
Are there any questions from the audience? Okay, so I have one question.
Right.
It may seem a little pervert, but just a little.
I'm specialist in pervert questions.
Oh, fantastic. So you mentioned the issue of divorce between representation and democracy, liberalism and democracy, and most excited one, capitalism and democracy.
That goes a very tricky way.
So my question is about stepmothers or stepfathers after this divorce, because you mentioned that the future is, let's say, not very optimistic. So maybe I'm an inappropriate optimist because maybe of my age, because of age, but
Definitely because of the age.
maybe. But history doesn't like empty space. Maybe these challenges can be seen as chances. So maybe representation, this divorce between representation and democracy, will provide us to rethink the idea of representation, maybe a chance to make more inclusionary democracy. For example, technology, you told very much about these negative aspects or this challenging aspect of flux of information, but maybe flux of information will be helpful to create more inclusionary democracy, to make inclusionary society. So that's the first step, mom. That's the first chance after this divorce. Second one, maybe this divorce of liberalism and democracy will end this specific idea that is called tyranny of merit, this political tyranny of merit. Maybe it's time to create a new version of democracy, so-called popular, or maybe to start creating some kind of popular constitutionalism.
What's that?
It's popular constitutionalism.
Yeah.
That's the idea that there can be no illiberal democracy like in Hungary, but can be popular democracy that is not liberal in this traditional sense, like less power to judges, less power to this traditional.
So this is going back to the rules, actually.
Yes, sometimes.
Back to the 70s.
Maybe 70s, but less power to judges, more power to direct democracy, more power to. That's
I understood what.
and the third one, maybe the most excited one, chance, is from this divorce of capitalism and democracy. Maybe before capitalism burned the planet with us on board, we can create an alternative, some kind of social democracy, Scandinavian style, this kind of marriage between maybe this kind of socialism, this kind of social welfare state and democracy. So can you answer to these three chances? Maybe the future is not so dark and so pessimistic. Maybe there are some chances to recreate to survive, recreate our institutions.
Yes, I'll have to take your phone after the lecture because you really calls me, so I'll call you frequently when I'm really disturbed to shed some light in my dark systems, you know. It's definitely because of the age. Actually, in the sunny years of European integration, this was a debate. So it's like you bring us back to the debate of the that circulated from the beginning of from the Maastricht Treaty until Lisbon, both on European and national level. And there was a book published by a German professor, Klaus Offe, called Demokratisierung der Demokratie, democratization of democracy, which was like that. So there were a lot of debates on how to democratize democracy, and there were several strands of this debate through participatory democracy. Well, we cannot create a fully fledged direct democracy because it's utopian and impossible. Why don't we enhance participation through different deliberative fora, through extension of voting rights, through some referenda, through engagement in different opinion polls, crowdsourcing. That's a new version of that debate. So crowdsourcing is a whole debate about participatory democracy, deliberative democracy in a new voice, so to say. And also the other strand, apart from participatory, although linked with it, was deliberative democracy. Like promote the people, say what they want. This was the optimistic version of technologies, which I shared until recently. I made a book presentation in Oxford in 2018. And I was kind of promoting some, you will be surprised, a very optimistic view on social networks. How they promote horizontal networking and how they create circles and networks which challenge the hierarchy. So through networking of experts, opinion polls, you can actually counterbalance the hierarchies and stuff like that. And my discussant was Oxford professor said, well, actually, I think it's the opposite. Technology actually promotes concentration of power. Unfortunately, there are tendencies that I was wrong. Of course, they promote both. They promote both networking. For example, there are great deliberation polls. There are a lot of options for businessmen, but also for scientists to network, to cooperate, to enhance, to go beyond the restraints of their own context, right? So it definitely promotes that horizontal societal aspect of constitutionalism, to put it in the words of Teubner, but also technologies always promote the powerful, right? And these asymmetries can be compensated in midterm or long term. This was done also through the inclusion of the bourgeoisie and then the other layers, the other strata in the constitutional construct, right? So there were misuse of power, discrepancies, but they were kind of pacified, reconciled, and included in the general construction. But now the asymmetries are extremely fast and extremely profound. So this is one of the reasons of the explosion, of the implosion of the democratic order, right? Because it cannot be compensated. The technological development is going extremely rapidly, and social reflection on it is very slow, right? What did I want to say? Yeah, so all these theories about participatory deliberative democracy rest upon, for example, the Habermasian suggestion that we can enter into what he calls communicative situation through communicative action, right? And we can, so the idea of Habermas, like him, I loved that theory when I was a student, and I'm definitely disenfranchised with it right now. If you just look, so just to tell the theory in detail how it looks like in practice. The theory is that we do not necessarily engage in fighting. We can actually create something like a common meaning and negotiate meaning through reason, through public reason accomplished in a discursive form. So the people engaging should engage in elections, electoral campaigns, in order to convince the electorate and then the other people that they offer reasonable projects, and they engage in parliamentary debates in order not to destroy the opponent, but to create a meaningful taxation, meaningful legislation, meaningful stuff, right? And they engage in public debates in the media or in Facebook or whatever, just to convince you, right? So I have certain opinion, you have different. We can open our hearts and minds, interconnect, right, through the third eye, right? Share our knowledge, and we jointly go happier after that discourse. So I have given up some of my postulates, you have given some of yours, and we create something like a common denominator. Or does it function like that? No. Look at Facebook, right? Everybody is there just to smash the opponent, right? You are physically destroyed. Very few of the people really try to convince the others. They are there to smash you with their big electronic hammer, right? To destroy your digital unit. Look at the parliaments, right? Everywhere. It's like either or. Almost nothing is really negotiated to the front. Of course, it can be negotiated backwards, but it's not deliberative democracy, it's technocracy, right? You are there to show to the public that your opponent is a rubbish, right? And you are great, right? Look at the electoral campaigns, right? Unfortunately, it seems that democracy in that extensive form is also context dependent. It's dependent on, for example, Switzerland, right? Can you transplant Swiss experience? No. There are many attempts at using Swiss experience elsewhere. Only some of them were to an extent successful, like Slovenia, but it's a very small country next to Switzerland. I mean, not exactly next, but like, okay. Or Estonia, like I love giving examples from Estonia or Iceland. Iceland, 300,000 people. Can you have e-governance in, even Krakow is bigger, right? Okay, I mean, so this is not applicable even to a country of 7 million like Bulgaria, not to speak about, yeah. So yeah, electronic decision making in Poland, not to speak about China, right? Like, and democracy, there are several nutrition factors. So I can give you a recipe how to cook democracy, how to prepare democracy, right? How to, yeah. So several things. One of them is middle class. You need relatively homogeneous, relatively equal societies. Relatively. It doesn't mean that the democracy poverty is excludatory and constitutional. Of course, you have poverty. Sometimes it's very unjust. Sometimes it's just because you just didn't make the effort. It doesn't mean that you don't have rich people. It doesn't mean that in democracy you don't have oligarchs. But you need middle class. And the middle class is dying everywhere, right? So with hierarchical societies, it's hard to create democracy, right? With super rich, and so the middle class of the 70s is now moderately poor people, right? So these are not people that have nothing to eat and sleep on the streets, but still it's not a middle class. Look at what happened in 2009 in America. People with flat screens and nice home furniture went to the parks, right? So you're not middle class if you have to repay your student's loan all your life, or when you have to pay your apartment for your whole of your life, right?
What is middle class, in fact? Because
middle class was the thing that was created after World War II in order to sustain democracy in the West, right? So middle class was the German or the French or the Italian middle class. These people. So you need two things. You need democratically minded elites. So people who are not necessarily natural-born Democrats, because nobody loves the people as such, just because of the love. But these are people who realize that democracy is a system that gives them a lot of opportunities that they can use, and they comply with the democratic rules. And it requires you need these people that, yeah, that's a very good qualification. You need people who are educated, rational, and also financially independent from the state, from public power. Right, that's also important. You need that type of capitalism of small and middle-sized companies, which are not dependent on public funding and on. There should be a genuine capitalist, right? The innovative, progressive type of, and this is the reason why democracy emerged. It was very limited democracy from our viewpoint. It's even not a democracy, but something which was more closest to democracy emerged in the states which first produced these social practices, like England. It didn't emerge in Austro-Hungary, which was the most enlightened society. So the degree of education, now we have Bruckner, Mahler, great composers, right? But democracy emerged in England. Why? Because we had these social preconditions of this middle class, right? And the same was true for the comparison between other countries, right?
Okay, one ad vocem maybe, because I beg to differ that these middle class is connected, maybe it's better to say that it's connected with free market society, not capitalism, because I think that it is some kind of idea that the worst enemy of free market societies it is capitalism.
In its uncontrolled form.
Yes, in this, because
it's also a variant of capitalism.
All this communist totalitarianism didn't have the power to create a monopoly such as big tech today. So maybe the capitalism will be a killer of this form of capitalism will be a killer of free market society.
And that reminds me that I didn't fully answer your question because there were a lot of theories or predictions what will actually destroy capitalism, and of course there were Marxist suggestions that the rise of the proletariat will destroy capitalism. There was a very optimistic suggestion. I don't know by whom. I read it in a British newspaper, so I cannot quote the name, but it was very nice. That actually, if you look at the codes, which makes you part of the elite, the medieval, Ständestaat, or the state or the absolute monarchy, was based on land, on the ownership of possession of land, as a code for inclusion. And if you read John Locke, especially the first treatise on government, it explains exactly why land, the appropriation of land, makes you also member of the political society. And then capitalism radically changed the code. It was a capital. Of course, it can be land, but also it can be everything. So the money or the other possessions, the capital makes you part of the elite, which was more democratic than land, of course, because it expanded the scope of people who are elite. And the suggestion of that author was that information will be the new code. So if you're in possession of information, you will be part of this postmodern elite. And this is kind of ultra-democratic because in order to be opinion leader, the more you spread, the more you rise. So this means that you have to not limit the other. of land by destroying the other people who claim, or even in capitalism, you have to diminish the wealth of the others in order to increase yours. Not exactly, but it's better than the land. But anyway, with information, the more you spread, the better you are, and this will be like a kind of horizontal paradise in a sense, right? Because yeah, is it really happening? Is this really the tendency? I mean, I'll put it just as a rhetorical question.
Okay, so are there any other questions? Yes.
Maybe the last one a little bit provocative. If you proposing to expertise the governor or the administration, maybe some way, maybe another option to the expertise the or something like a Technocracy or with connected with the liberation to no one expert like Gandalf it's hard to exchange, but if we make some the expertised voters, maybe it's another option.
To make everybody Gandalf, like to teach them how to practice magic.
Or send Barlovs.
Send what?
Barlovs.
What was that?
It's the fire demon. Kill them.
Yeah. That's a very pessimistic conclusion. Okay. Or that may be even more pessimistic. Maybe the Balrogs were there and you're already dead. So you're already dead, but you don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I really, that goes beyond my expertise, That's really a question. I mean, no, I mean, you can definitely not go through the public because it's impossible. I mean, it was always utopian, but in a society with relatively limited knowledge, you can at least try to. That attempt was done with the universally developed personality and stuff like that also during communism. And now, I mean, I think I'm a relatively knowledgeable person, but I'm totally ignorant in 90% of the things. So you cannot educate even me, right? I mean, and the politicians, are they supposed to be experts? Well, I'm not absolutely sure, right? So I don't choose somebody because he is a very good engineer or doctor. I choose him because he promises me ideologically appealing and pragmatically appealing things. So that's the role of politicians, to show the way forward and to promote coherent strategies, not to be experts, right? That's why but on the other hand, the tendency is inevitable, right? So the death of politics we're witnessing not only the death of democracy, we're witnessing the death of politics, which is deeper, right? Because politics, that's what I mean. So we're claiming about issues with democracy, but I'm sure if there was, because there is no, but if there was a critical opinion in autocracies, they will be also having a lecture like this, claiming that the good of autocracy is dying. And the experts are taking over the autocracies. So there are many autocrats which are like puppets, like they're just put there because the people want to see them to serve some integrative effect, to feel secure. Right? And they're not. And this might be, again, something absolutely objective, because really that degree of technological development is overburdening. It's a game changer. Yeah.
So, Professor Belov, we made it. It's 12 o'clock. Thank you very much one last time. And the applause for Professor Belov, please.
It was a great pleasure.